Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday to you all. It's a delight that you've taken the time to join us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And for those of you, if I haven't met you yet, I'm Dan. I'm a teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life. And today, we're just going to continue through this journey that we've been following through the Redeeming Life reading plan that's been leading us through this very pastoral book called 1 Corinthians. And you'll know if you're following along with the reading plan that we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 24 today. So the first half of chapter 7 is really all we're going to tackle. And this passage is certainly, it's quite intimate, not least because we realize that this chapter, chapter 7, verse 1, marks a new section within the book where Paul is specifically addressing issues and questions the church in Corinth themselves actually address. In other words, everything that Paul has hitherto written is addressing issues that Paul himself has diagnosed through word of mouth, whether that's through Sosthenes or through people through Chloe's household, that this is what's happening in Corinth, and Paul is taking it upon himself to diagnose the problem, to correct them, and to continue to point the Corinthians back to the cross, back to the gospel, back to Christ, back to God's purposes for all of creation, including these believers in Corinth. But now, here in chapter 7, you'll read in verse 1, it says, "Now for the matters that you wrote about, you Corinthians, you wrote about these issues that you wanted me to tell you about, to try and give you some practical pastoral counsel. Now I'm going to address the issues that you yourselves addressed." And now, the issues that the Corinthians themselves addressed are numerous. And here in chapter 7, actually, Paul really does bounce from one subject to the other, all of them related in a curious fashion, but bouncing around to different subjects about marriage, about divorce, about widows, about virgins, about abstinence, about sexual morality, where it appears to be, it would seem from the outside, that one of the things that the Corinthians don't know, and you can't quite assume that they're always going to know, because probably many, if not most of them, are not Jews, and they haven't inherited what you would call a Judeo-Christian ethic. That is, here's my body, it's a sexual thing. In what ways am I honoring God through my sexuality? And it touches on all different kinds of things. And especially if you were raised in a place like Corinth and you went to the temple of Aphrodite and you knew that any given day there would have been maybe upwards to 1,000 priestesses, sexual prostitutes, of which you would actually go and worship this god through copulation with a temple prostitute. If that's what they think of about sexual immorality as far as what it is that's pleasing to God, you can imagine they might have a few questions about sexual immorality, and even going so far as to suggest, as it appears some among the church, some people within the church are suggesting that even married couples should become celibate. That appears to be some of the teaching that's spreading around among the Corinthians that Paul himself is going to address, where, yes, there are probably certain occasions where there's a time for celibacy between a husband and a wife, but on the whole, this is not something that should be prescriptive and binding in all Christian couples at all times. And another big question that's facing them that's still actually relevant in many cases, that is, suppose there's a married person, a husband or a wife, one of whom decides to become a disciple of Jesus, but the other one doesn't. Does that mean that they need to divorce? That's an interesting question. Here's what Paul has to say. This is how it is he addresses it. And now, mind you, it's in a passage like this where it can be sometimes very difficult to hear from what Paul is saying, to hear what's descriptive or what's prescriptive, and not just seeing what Paul is prescribing to the Corinthians in his practical pastoral advice, but why he is prescribing it. All of those things are relevant considerations when we sit down and read a passage like this. But here's what it is that I would want to suggest to you. What I want you to have your eyes open and your magnifying glasses out to look for is that the advice and the counsel that Paul gives as a matter of instruction from the Lord, or instruction from his own pastoral wisdom, is that each of these decisions are always made in light of God's purposes. That the way to navigate these vexing issues, especially one dealing with things like sexuality and human sexuality, what do we do with that? That the principal way in which Paul sort of pulls out his compass and is navigating these issues and trying to lead the Corinthian church through these troubled waters is to say, how do we handle this problem? How do we make godly decisions? Well, we do so in light of God's purposes for them personally, their purposes for them domestically, their purposes for them communally, their purposes for them civically, and even also purposes for them globally. In other words, the way in which that you're thinking about the decisions to make in light of God's purposes, they aren't just isolated. And certainly, in order to make a godly decision, that you have to be able to ask more questions than just asking, is it sinful? You can do certain things that may or may not be sinful, but yet are still bad decisions, poor decisions, because you never stop to think about them in light of God's purposes. And that appears to be the guiding the guiding principle that Paul is going by as he's navigating this with the 1 Corinthians. So, with this in mind, what you're going to find is he's addressing these issues, and then we're going to close it with what I would say in the last few verses, we're going to behold with our very eyes the principle that Paul is following that informs his prescription and why it is that he's instructing him to do the things that they're doing. So with that in mind, let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. Which, by the by, that's actually very surprising coming from a Jew like Paul, who historically and culturally speaking as a Jew, would have had a very high and noble view on the value of marriage. So for him to say that it's good for a man not to marry is actually kind of surprising. But we're going to find out why. It says this: but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift and another has that. So for someone like Paul, who might be tempted by his culture and his standards to regard marriage as an ultimate good, doesn't do so, but rather as a gift, where singleness is a gift from God. Marriage is a gift from God, and as such should be regarded as such. And and that's the sort of thing that's guiding these decisions. And mind you, in what we just read, Paul sounds anything but patriarchal. That is, to give prescriptions that give benefit and special honor to the male. That is, that women are merely serving to satisfy the sexual appetites of a man. And conversely, that women, for the sexually fiery and ferocious, if you want to call it that, that the man only serves to be able to satisfy her sexual appetites. Not the case. Where the respect and understanding of this thing that we call one flesh has bound a husband and a wife together intimately and even spiritually in a way that it's actually bound together by covenant fidelity and bringing out and serving the best for each one. But that's another matter. I'm digressing. But let's continue. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, mind you, the interpretation of a passage like this has been strung out and stretched thin for centuries to get to the bottom, is to say, Paul, what is it that you actually mean when he says that an unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and conversely through a believing wife through the husband, otherwise children not being holy? I think one of the clues is actually in the next passage. That is, but if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Where at some point between putting these verses together, it doesn't appear as though that what Paul means by having been sanctified actually refers to legitimate salvation. But in other words, that through the faithfulness of one partner, that this is, I guess, the best way that I think I can describe it, is that sanctification, especially when it comes to intimate people, has a contagious effect to it. Not that the other person doesn't have any control over it, but that as God is sanctifying and making holy one person, that inevitably that sanctifying work is going to affect people who are around them, especially the most intimate variety, namely a husband or a wife. And well, it would be a mistake to be able to say that somehow salvation could be sort of attained if, there's an unbelieving husband and a believing wife, or a believing husband and an unbelieving wife, that somehow you can sort of ride that person's coattails into the kingdom of God. I don't think that that's what it's saying, but rather that the effects of sanctification can still be realized, as there's even one member of this body who says, even though you're married to this unbelieving person, that my sanctifying work that's happening upon you is going to have its effect on your unbelieving spouse, for better or for worse, and that this can actually lead to fruitfulness. And one very interesting and closely related story or effect where this happened would happen through a man called Vincent Furnier. You might know him better as Alice Cooper, who he was led to the Lord and faith in Jesus Christ through the faith of his wife, and his wife, who was affected, who came into a living faith with Jesus through one of their housekeepers. And it's not that somehow, because of one spouse's decision, that somehow magically affected somebody else, but rather there's this contagious sanctifying work about the way in which we've already read it in 1 Corinthians 6, that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, that God is living and dwelling inside of us. And if that's true, its effect is going to be felt. It's going to be tangible in the lives of those around us. And pray by God's grace, it actually leads to the fruit of salvation. But there is a real sanctifying work that God's purposes are more tangible, closely felt, and realized, even in the life of an unbelieving partner by virtue of a spouse who's decided to follow Jesus. It's a real thing. But let's continue. It says, nevertheless, again, this is where we can see the principle that's behind Paul's prescription up to this point. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. Let me read that again. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. In other words, the thing that matters most, that's even above these decisions, is the light of God's purposes, God's calling, his assignment. That if we stop, we're never going to make any lasting, fruitful decisions throughout all of these problems unless we prioritize the fact that we're supposed to retain the place in life that God assigns us and to which he has called us. God has a calling on your life and to mine. And if we don't live our lives in light of that calling, we've missed the mark. Thank God for his salvation. I am thankful that God has saved us from sin, but he saved us for a purpose. And I don't want to waste my life because I wasn't listening to God's call upon my life and his assignment for me, that God doesn't just want to work in me, but that he wants to work through me. Anyway, but let's continue. It says, this is the rule I laid down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Now, how exactly you can be circumcised and then become uncircumcised, I don't really know, but this is just Paul's way of saying, like, even if you could do it that way, it's not going to matter because these things are trivial in the light of God's purposes. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the situation which he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freed man. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. Verse 22, I submit to you, summarizes in the best way I think I can articulate possible is the divine paradox about how service to God is perfect freedom. If you wanted a verse to be able to summarize all of that, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 22 would be the one. Well, let's continue. You are bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man as responsible to God should remain in the situation God called him to. So thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions. I encourage you, if you haven't, subscribed to the YouTube channel or check out our podcast if that's an easier access for you. And also consider supporting us through the church planting work that we're doing here. And also consider meeting up with us and doing ministry live here, whether that's in Huntington County or Whitley County here. We're excited about the possibility of being able to work together, to be God's hands and feet, and loving people and helping people grow to grow mature disciples here through the work that God's called us to. So God bless you. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you next time.